spend a lot of time in the water recreationally fishing.
Yep.
I don't see a whole lot of dead fish on the banks.
Correct.
So are there studies being done as far as are they dying because of something in the water? Are they dying because of lack of nutrients?
So there's a lot of different studies going on in Puget Sound in general. So the question was, why, sort of like, where are the dead fish showing up? Why don't we see more of them? There's a lot of studies looking at what seems like a delayed mortality response of some form. Now, if the fish are just, say, not getting enough food, they go out into Puget Sound, they're scrawny, they might be easier to pick off by any number of predators. If it's more of a disease issue, say contamination affects their health, they then also are sort of a weakling, shall we say, and more easily preyed upon as they go out. There's a whole bunch of different studies that have been done over a longer period showing that first year out in the ocean is really important. If they're not big enough for their first winter, they generally don't make it through that winter because they don't have enough fat stored and foods at lower amounts in general. So it's not like you would necessarily just see them dying in the Duwamish. We know they rear and use the Duwamish because we've done studies to look at their timing and how much they use it. So it's more of an assumed delayed mortality somewhere down the chain after they leave the Duwamish.
None of that is tied into the plan. When it talks about predation or prey food sources, there's no information.
So we talk about it in certain aspects more in the technical underpinnings of the plan than in the plan itself. So the plan is more of a summary document. Then there's a summary technical document called the Strategic Assessment that summarizes about this many different documents kind of thing, and that's where that information is tucked in. So it is brought out in the plan in several places, but it's not like comprehensively described all the different problems. There's a lot of technical documents that went into the plan, and this other 4 documents or 4 technical papers are really updating that information.
Talked about keeping them in the up or middle green.
Yes.
How would you anticipate managing that?
The best way to do that is to restore the habitat that's in the middle green by taking some of the levees that currently are along the river and keeping the river like the lower green between just 2 banks with no area off channel. So the Porter project, which you mentioned you live near, that took the levee out and set it back along the road as far as the road protection. And that created all this rearing habitat for those par type that can live in that area and thus rear, and they only spend a very short, like a week or 2 at most, in the Duwamish later when they migrate out. So we need to create more habitats like that. So the Porter project is an example of one of those. The Auburn Narrows just downstream of Highway 18, the Potsky project, those are all bank removals or bank armoring setbacks, and there are many others that we have in mind further upstream. We're currently working on one called the Loans Levee setback, which is closer to what was that?
Burns
Yes,
Creek?
yes, the outlet of Burns Creek.
Is there any possibility of restoring Burns Creek? I grew up in the valley, so I've been there, I won't say how many years, but it used to be a beautiful, pristine creek until they put the dam in, and then that stopped the flooding that went through and washed it out every year. And now it's just a big swamp, and the fish have a hard time getting through. They do get through, but yeah.
So the question was, is there a possibility to restore Burns Creek, which is a right bank tributary that comes in River Mile 45, 50, somewhere in there. There are potential to restore it. We're also doing some extra studies this year. Another biologist in our office, to try and look at off-channel habitat, stream habitats like Burns Creek, to see how much juvenile Chinook use are using those areas. Burns Creek is too small a creek system to produce Chinook on its own, but it doesn't mean that juveniles don't go into it and rear there and stay there. So we're looking at a similar study in the lower green. Most of the tributaries have flap gates on them and stop fish from using them. And so we're looking at how valuable are those habitats in comparison to some of the habitats that Matt presented on in his talk with the side channel, where we know fish are using those, more than the main stem, but we want to know how much those tributary habitats are being used as well. So once we get a little more information, Burns Creek might go up in level of importance for us to work on. Okay.
Jessica, what's climate change going to do to all this? And Josh, with this use in climate change, I think some things to reflect.
Definitely. Yeah, so as part of the update, there's also a white paper on how climate change will be impacting salmon. And that's also part of our strategic climate action plan that you heard Josh Baldy touch on. So under the preparedness section of that strategic climate action plan, there were 12 priority actions listed. One of them being making sure that we're assessing what climate change impacts have on the salmon populations in all of our watersheds. And so the update to this plan and other watershed plans was a perfect opportunity for us to consider climate change. So in the white paper, you'll see a breakdown of various climate change impacts such as sea level rise, sedimentation, increased water temperature. Then we have a paragraph about how that is impacting the salmon populations. Then what is the local context for that specific watershed, and then technical recommendations to help mitigate and adapt to those plans or to those impacts. And so looking at other cool water tributaries as a way for us to prioritize projects like that instead of maybe focusing on main stems. So as Colin pointed out, we heard a lot about the great work that's happening in the watershed to help with restoration of habitat. So that great work is going to continue, but it might be prioritized differently to look at like a cool water tributary to help with refugia habitat instead of maybe the main stem. So that's kind of what the plan, the white paper addresses, is how do we look at what we're already going to be doing maybe a little bit differently to accommodate for those climate change impacts.
Yeah, and so related to what you were saying with climate change impacts, temperature conditions in the green are likely to influence fish, and with climate change, temperature conditions are likely going to be changing in various different ways. So an emerging priority that was brought up with the forum and group was what are temperature impacts on salmon and what are temperature conditions throughout the Green River. So we put together a technical report that kind of discusses what do temperature conditions look like in the green, what are the potential impacts on adult and juvenile life stages, and then what might that look like in the future with what Jessica was saying when climate change impacts come in and water temperatures might be warmer, or we see differences in our hydrologic regime. And so built into that, we know that temperature might be warming, flows might be changing. So what could we do? We talk about like riparian, planting trees and stuff like that, but there might be other strategies like thinking about cold tributaries or hypereic water, which is water that flows just below the water in the stream bed. Similarly, how could we potentially utilize areas of groundwater inputs, which is deep water below the stream bank that brings in cold water. So trying to bring in all these different elements to understand how we can first understand the thermal and hydrologic dynamics in the river, and how we can help create that kind of capacity and room to deal with climate change and to deal with these extreme temperature conditions that are likely to influence the juvenile and adult fish. You want to talk about the habitat use? Chris? Or, you haven't mentioned me, but I don't hear.
And I think the graphic, since we touched on this in the presentation, it's a great graphic that actually shows the different climate change impacts at all of the various life stages of each of the salmon. So this is a really good conceptualization of what this white paper has in it. So that's a great graphic for folks to take a look at, and it's also in the white paper.
So that graphic is on the Ryan website. It takes a little while to look through it. It talks about the 4 primary sort of impacts of climate change and where it affects different salmon. It's more directly covered in that paper in more detail than we can probably cover in this crowd kind of thing. So strongly encourage you to look at that. There's a similar one that was created for the Snoqualmie River system to try and look at the different timing of different fish species and how that might play out.
A lot of the discussion today talked about the main stem, the Duwamish working up. Do you have any comment as to what you're all doing for the 2 main tributaries, Sixth Creek and Moroccan Creek?
So the question was, do we have any comments about, are we doing anything on Sue's Creek and the Whatcom Creek, which are the two largest tributaries that come in the Middle Green? So those two tributaries, we have a fair amount of work occurring actually on them because they are the two tributaries that support Chinook spawning, whereas most of the other tributaries in the system don't. And so we've done a whole bunch of planting and riparian projects in the Whatcom Creek, as well as some larger restoration in and around Big Spring Creek project. We've driven over in that area. We meandered a portion that was very ditched, coming at a very cold water source. We put in a lot of off-channel habitat, a lot of wood, a lot of plants, trying to restore that. We've seen Chinook already back in that system, that smaller creek system since. So we've put a lot more effort in the Whatcom Creek than in Sue's Creek. And I think we're starting to ramp up doing a little more in Sue's Creek. Sue's Creek, if you're not familiar with it, has a hatchery down near the mouth, and they control the number of fish that are allowed upstream. If they don't have enough for the hatchery, they don't let any up. When they have, when they've met their needs, they let up only 1,500, and then they cut them off. So we get a lot of questions from people that live in Sue's Creek system saying, I used to see lots of fish, I don't anymore, what are you guys doing? And it really comes down to how the hatchery gets managed now, and they've changed their management system, so there's just not nearly as many fish getting allowed to go into the system, because Department of Fish and Wildlife does not believe that putting more fish in will produce more fish coming out.
How I've done to substantiate that idea that more fish won't produce more.
So that's more about the number of adults that they put into the Sue's Creek system. And so I guess the other thing I would say is that you saw the trend line that were in Doug's presentation. Both the wild and the hatchery population numbers have been on a steady decline for quite some time. So quite honestly, when we talk about salmon recovery, we normally talk about the 4 H's: habitat, harvest, hatcheries, and height of dams. Clearly, each one of those has an impact and can be helpful to salmon recovery. In this case, they're producing a lot of hatchery fish, and even those aren't surviving either. Hatcheries cannot just solve all of our problems. It still comes back to the habitat. So, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Anyone else have any questions or additional information they'd like to give?
Back from local jurisdictions? And if so, how do you address that and deal with that?
Okay, so he asked about kind of the politics of the plan and whether we anticipate any local pushback, and how do we anticipate for that? Well, part of this whole, the way the WIRA is organized is that we are a coalition of 17 local governments. Although the WIRA is housed within King County is really just the service provider. So every significant step of the way, we take kind of the ideas to both a technical committee, which then approves things, and ultimately goes before the Watershed Ecosystem Forum for approval. So recently we had an update of habitat goals, and that we took it to the forum, make a presentation which consists of representatives from all the local governments. And that way there's no surprises. At each step of the way they're able to discuss any concerns they may have, questions, and ultimately we seek consensus in moving forward.
But then I think to address it from there, even once the forum's done with it and says this is good, they recommend it to the jurisdictions. And everything we change in the habitat plan based on this information has to go through every single local government from King County to the city of Algona. So there could be pushback. There certainly is going to be a lot of questions wherever jurisdiction you're from, you might want to go to some of those meetings and let them know that you support salmon recovery efforts, because it does have implications to city and county budgets to do this work. So like most things that have implications to budgets, it takes people to participate in the process to say this is important to you to spend your money this way, and spend it on a way that the science says is an efficient, effective way of spending it. But it goes through the political process like there's no tomorrow.
It's hard enough to get one jurisdiction agreed upon, not just.
Yeah.
It's even harder with 17.
That's the tagging and monitoring elected officials.
So the question is, do we use ecosystem services in?
Yeah. Question, ecosystem services, how do we factor that? First thing I'd like to say is the 2005 Salmon Habitat Plan for the GreenDuwamish has an entire chapter on ecosystem services. We were the only group in Puget Sound, in the state for that matter, that kind of embraced this notion that we should value the value of the natural capital of protecting and restoring the habitat. And the reason we did that chapter is, as you can imagine, just like what you saw on all these slides today, we've really changed this watershed. We've paved it over, we've drained it, we've replumbed it, etc., and more people are coming. So it was really hard for me in those years prior to the habitat plan to make a compelling case for funders to fund restoration in this watershed, because a lot of people would write it off. It's too polluted. You spend, for that same amount of money, we could buy 500 acres in the upper Skagit. So we actually factored in the ecosystem service valuation in hopes that it would help us make a compelling argument that an investment into these restoration and protection projects in this watershed had a rate of return. And what we found is not only a rate of return, it actually, pound for pound, when you do a restoration project, say like in the Duwamish estuary, the return on investment is gigantic. It's just like, it was described to me early on, it's like any kind of scarce resource, like the estuary of the Duwamish, where there might be 1% of it functioning, every small little percent that you put back in is like a diamond. Value is huge because of the rarity. So ecological economics helped us make that argument to every funding group, and even kind of to ourselves as a ground check, because the challenges are huge, that what we're doing is worth it. It's worth just to keep fighting and fighting and fighting to get the funding and the political support to do these projects that we're talking about today.
7. There's handouts on the tables as well as handouts at our table in the symposium room. But essentially there we're going to go much deeper into the salmon habitat plan. We're going to go into kind of a retrospective of where we've been over the last 12 years, an update of kind of the scope of the plan update, a timeline, again going into a further detail of the emerging science related to climate change, habitat use, and water quality, and then have kind of sub-watershed breakout groups where we can organize based on individual interest on whether you do work primarily in the upper watershed or the lower Duwamish, to kind of begin to discuss what are the successes we've had, what are some of the challenges we've run into, as kind of what are those additional areas that we need to focus on moving forward. And that will really kind of serve as the foundation as we move forward with the plan update and begin to take additional topics to our implementational technical committee as well as to the ecosystem board. And so again, that is March 27th. That'll be in Tukwila from 10 to 2:30 p.m. So.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.